The air hung heavy and thick, a suffocating blanket woven from the humid breath of the Mississippi and the cloying sweetness of sugarcane. It was the kind of Louisiana morning in 1850, where the sun, barely above the horizon, already promised a day of relentless, sweat-drenching labor. The cicadas had begun their incessant, high-pitched chorus, a sound as much a part of the landscape as the cypress knees and the slow, muddy currents of the bayou. This particular morning, however, held a different kind of weight, a premonition that settled like the morning mist over the fields of the Dubois Plantation. Antoine Broussard, his back already aching from years of toil, gripped the handle of his shovel, the wood smooth and worn against his calloused palm. He stood with a dozen other men, their faces grimed with dust and fatigue, at the edge of a newly cleared section of land. Monsieur Jean-Luc Dubois, the plantation owner, a man whose wealth was as vast and impenetrable as the surrounding swamps, had decided this patch, long overgrown with tenacious weeds and stubborn palmetto, was finally ready for cultivation. Silas Croft, the overseer, a man whose shadow seemed to stretch longer and darker than his actual frame, barked orders, his voice raspy from too much shouting and cheap tobacco. "Move it, you lazy lot. The sun ain't waiting for you to dream." Croft spat, his eyes pale and cold, sweeping over the group. "Dig deep. We need this ground turned over by sundown." Antoine plunged his shovel into the earth, the rich, dark soil yielding with a sigh. The work was monotonous, a rhythm of lift, turn, and throw, punctuated by the grunts of his fellow workers and the distant, mournful cry of a heron. He thought of Marie, his wife, and their young son, Etienne, back in the quarters, their faces a fleeting comfort against the harsh reality of his days. He focused on the task, trying to lose himself in the physical exertion, to numb the constant ache in his muscles and the deeper, more persistent ache in his spirit. Hours bled into one another. The sun climbed higher, beating down with an intensity that seemed to press the very air out of their lungs. Sweat stung Antoine's eyes, blurring the already shimmering landscape. The men worked in a line, their shovels rising and falling in a grim, synchronized dance. Then, a sudden sharp cry pierced the drone of the cicadas and the rhythmic thud of shovels. It was Baptiste, a younger man, strong but prone to nervous jitters. He stood frozen, his shovel half buried in the earth, his eyes wide with a terror that seemed to drain the color from his face. "Mon Dieu," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the general din. What is this?" Antoine, a few paces away, paused, his own shovel suspended mid-air. A ripple of unease spread through the line of workers. Croft, ever vigilant for any break in the labor, strode forward, his heavy boots crunching on the dry earth. "What's the meaning of this, Baptiste? Get back to work." But Baptiste didn't move. He simply pointed a trembling finger at the ground. Where his shovel had struck, the earth had given way not to more soil, but to something else. Something hard and unnervingly regular. Antoine moved closer, his heart beginning to thump a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He saw it then. A dark, rectangular shape, partially exposed, unlike any rock or root he had ever encountered. It was too uniform, too deliberate. Croft, his face contorted in a sneer, pushed Baptiste aside. "Out of my way, fool." He peered into the shallow trench. His sneer faltered, replaced by a flicker of something unreadable in his pale eyes. He prodded the object with the toe of his boot. The sound was dull, hollow. What in the devil's name? Antoine, driven by a morbid curiosity he couldn't suppress, knelt beside the hole. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the rough, decaying wood. It was a coffin, or what remained of one. The wood was old, waterlogged and crumbling, but its shape was unmistakable. A collective gasp went through the small group of men who had gathered, their shovels now forgotten. "Keep digging, carefully," Croft ordered, his voice now devoid of its usual bluster, tinged instead with a strange, almost fearful urgency. "Let's see what else is down there." The men resumed their work, but the rhythm was broken, replaced by a hesitant, almost reverent pace. Each scoop of earth was now performed with a new caution, a silent dread hanging over them. It wasn't long before another dark rectangle emerged, then another, and another. a grim, silent procession of forgotten boxes laid out in a disturbingly neat row just beneath the surface of the earth. The sun beat down, but a chill had settled over the field. The cicadas' song seemed to grow louder, more insistent, like 1,000 tiny voices whispering secrets. The men exchanged uneasy glances, their eyes wide with unspoken questions. Who were these buried here? Why were they hidden, without markers, without crosses, without even a simple mound of earth to distinguish their resting places? The Dubois plantation had a small, well-tended cemetery for its white residents, and a separate, less formal plot for the enslaved, marked by crude wooden crosses that often rotted away within a few seasons. But these were different. These were deliberately concealed, erased from the landscape, as if their very existence was meant to be forgotten. Antoine felt a cold dread seep into his bones. He had lived on this land his entire life, as had his parents and grandparents. He knew every rise and dip, every ancient oak and winding path. Yet this particular patch of ground, so close to the main house, so seemingly innocuous, had held this secret for years, perhaps decades. The sheer number of them stretching out in a grim line suggested not an isolated incident, but a pattern, a deliberate act of concealment. The air, already heavy with humidity, now felt thick with unspoken history, with the ghosts of those whose names had been swallowed by the earth. Croft, his face now a mask of grim determination, ordered them to continue, but his usual threats were absent. He seemed as unnerved as the men, though he tried to hide it behind a facade of gruff authority. "Just clear the dirt. Don't touch anything else," he commanded, his voice lower than usual. "I'll fetch Monsieur Dubois." As Croft hurried away, his boots kicking up dust, the men worked in a stunned silence. The exposed coffins, their wood dark and decaying, seemed to breathe a silent accusation into the oppressive air. Antoine felt a prickle of fear, a primal instinct warning him that they had stumbled upon something far more sinister than forgotten graves. This was not merely death, this was erasure. And in a place like the Dubois plantation, erasure often meant something far more terrifying than a simple burial. It meant a story deliberately buried, a truth meant to remain forever hidden beneath the Louisiana soil. The sun continued its relentless climb, but the day had already turned cold, shadowed by the grim discovery beneath their feet. The discovery of the first coffin had been a shock, a jolt to the monotonous rhythm of their lives. But as the morning wore on, and the line of unearthed wooden boxes stretched further, the shock curdled into a profound, unsettling dread. The men, usually quick to jest or complain, worked in a silence so heavy it pressed down on them more than the oppressive heat. Each scrape of a shovel, each thud of earth, seemed to echo the silent accusation rising from the ground. Baptiste, still pale, had been moved to a less sensitive area, his nerves too frayed to continue near the grim row. Antoine, however, found himself unable to look away. He worked methodically, carefully, his eyes constantly drawn to the exposed wood. The coffins were crude, unadorned, clearly not meant for any formal burial. They were simply boxes, hastily constructed, then hastily interred. There were no names carved into the wood, no dates, no symbols of faith. Just raw, decaying timber. The Louisiana heat was a living entity, a suffocating presence that clung to their skin, seeped into their clothes, and made every breath a struggle. The air shimmered above the fields, distorting the distant line of cypress trees that marked the edge of the bayou. The scent of damp earth, usually a comforting aroma of fertility, now mingled with a faint, cloying odor that Antoine couldn't quite place, but which sent a shiver down his spine. It was the smell of something old, something forgotten, something that had been hidden for too long. "How many, Antoine?" whispered Etienne, not his son, but another young man, barely older than a boy, who worked beside him. His voice was hoarse, his eyes darting nervously from one coffin to the next. Antoine didn't answer immediately. He counted in his head, a grim tally. 13, he finally said, his own voice a low murmur. 13 so far, Etienne, and the row keeps going. 13. The number itself felt ominous. It wasn't a family plot, not a small group. This was a deliberate, systematic burial. The sheer scale of it was what truly unsettled them. It spoke of a secret too large to be accidental, too dark to be easily explained. Monsieur Dubois arrived shortly after Croft had fetched him, his usual crisp linen suit already showing damp patches under the arms despite the early hour. He was a man of imposing stature, his face usually set in an expression of stern authority. But today, Antoine noticed a subtle shift. Dubois' eyes, usually sharp and commanding, held a flicker of something akin to apprehension as he surveyed the scene. He walked slowly along the edge of the trench, his gaze sweeping over the exposed coffins, his lips pressed into a thin, grim line. "What is this, Croft?" Dubois' voice was low, controlled, but there was an edge to it that Antoine had rarely heard. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It was something colder, more calculating. "Unmarked graves, monsieur," Croft replied, his voice equally subdued. "A whole row of them. We just stumbled upon them clearing the new field." Dubois stopped at the end of the line, his back to the workers. He stood there for a long moment, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon, as if searching for answers in the shimmering heat. The silence stretched, broken only by the buzzing of flies and the distant croaking of frogs from the bayou. The men held their breath, waiting, watching. They knew that whatever Dubois decided, their lives would be irrevocably touched by this discovery. Finally, Dubois turned, his expression carefully neutral. "Continue digging," he commanded, his voice regaining some of its usual authority, though it still lacked its customary bite. "But be careful. Do not disturb the contents. I want to know the full extent of this situation." He emphasized the word situation, as if trying to diminish the gravity of what lay before them. "And tell no one. Not a word of this leaves this field. Is that understood?" His gaze swept over the workers, lingering on Antoine for a fraction of a second longer than on the others. A collective murmur of assent went through the group. They understood. Silence was a currency on the plantation, often bought with fear. As the day progressed, the row of graves grew longer. 14, 15, 16. The count climbed steadily, each new discovery deepening the mystery and the dread. The men worked with a grim efficiency, their movements precise, almost ritualistic. They were no longer just digging. They were unearthing a secret, piece by agonizing piece. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, but the beauty of the sunset was lost on the men. Their faces were streaked with dirt and sweat, their eyes hollow with exhaustion and a growing sense of unease. By the time the last rays of light faded, 21 coffins had been exposed, stretching in a perfectly straight line, a grim testament to some forgotten tragedy. Antoine leaned on his shovel, his muscles screaming in protest, but his mind was racing. He tried to recall any stories, any whispers, any old tales that might explain this, but there was nothing. The older folks sometimes spoke of the old times, of sickness and hardship, but never of anything like this. These were not the haphazard burials of a sudden plague, nor the marked graves of those who simply passed. This was something else entirely. The air grew cooler as darkness descended, bringing with it the chorus of night creatures, crickets, frogs, and the occasional hoot of an owl. The exposed coffins seemed to glow faintly in the twilight, their presence more pronounced, more menacing in the fading light. A heavy mist began to roll in from the bayou, swirling around the men's ankles, lending an ethereal, ghostly quality to the scene. Croft, his face now etched with a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion, dismissed them with a curt nod. "Go, get some rest. We'll be back at first light." His voice was flat, devoid of its usual menace. Even he seemed subdued by the day's grim work. As Antoine walked back to the quarters, the image of the 21 unmarked graves burned into his mind. He could still smell the damp earth, the faint cloying odor. He could still feel the weight of the unspoken questions. Who were they? Why were they buried like this? And what secret did their silent resting places hold that Monsieur Dubois was so desperate to keep hidden? The plantation, usually a place of predictable misery, now felt infused with a new, chilling mystery, a darkness that had been unearthed along with the forgotten dead. He knew with a certainty that settled deep in his gut that this was only the beginning. The ground had given up its dead, but the truth remained buried, waiting to be found. The Dubois plantation, known formerly as Belle Rêve, was a sprawling empire of cotton and cane, its prosperity built on the backs of hundreds of enslaved men, women, and children. From the outside, it presented an image of antebellum grandeur. A magnificent white-columned manor house, manicured gardens, and vast fields stretching to the horizon. But beneath this veneer of wealth and civility, Belle Rêve harbored a reputation, whispered in hushed tones among the enslaved communities of neighboring parishes, a reputation that spoke of more than just the usual hardships of bondage. Jean-Luc Dubois, the current patriarch, had inherited Belle Rêve from his father, a man known for his ruthless efficiency. Jean-Luc, however, possessed a colder, more detached cruelty. He was a man of few words, his commands delivered with an icy precision that left no room for argument. He rarely raised his voice, preferring to let Silas Croft, his overseer, handle the day-to-day brutality. But everyone knew that Croft was merely Dubois' instrument, and the true power, the true chilling authority, resided in the quiet, calculating mind of the master. Whispers about Belle Rêve had always circulated, stories of men and women who simply vanished, not sold off to distant plantations, but gone without a trace. A fever, a sudden illness, a runaway attempt gone wrong. These were the official explanations, delivered with a dismissive wave of the hand. But the enslaved people knew better. They knew the subtle signs, the way a person's name would suddenly cease to be spoken, the way their meager belongings would disappear from the quarters, not packed for a journey, but simply gone. These disappearances were not frequent enough to cause open rebellion, but they were regular enough to sow a deep, pervasive fear. Antoine had heard these stories since he was a boy. He remembered his grandmother, a woman whose eyes held the wisdom of generations, telling him to always keep his head down, to never draw attention to himself. "Belle Rêve has hungry shadows, little one," she'd warned, her voice barely a whisper. "Shadows that swallow folk whole." He had dismissed them as old wives' tales, the natural fears of a people living under constant threat. But now, with the 21 unmarked graves staring up at him from the earth, those whispers took on a terrifying new resonance. The arrival of Dr. Alistair Finch several years prior had added another layer to Belle Rêve's unsettling aura. Dr. Finch was not a local physician. He had arrived from the north, a man of precise manners and an unsettling intensity in his gaze. He was a man of science, Dubois had announced, a scholar dedicated to advancing medical knowledge. He had been given a small, isolated building on the edge of the plantation, far from the main house and the quarters, which he had converted into a sort of clinic or laboratory. At first his presence had been met with a cautious optimism. Perhaps he would bring better care, some relief from the constant ailments that plagued the enslaved population. But that hope quickly faded. Dr. Finch's methods were strange. He rarely treated common fevers or broken bones. Instead, he seemed interested in more obscure conditions, in observations and studies. He would select individuals, often those who were already weakened or ill, and take them to his clinic. Sometimes they would return, looking gaunt and distant, their eyes holding a haunted quality. More often, they simply did not return at all. Antoine remembered the case of old Maman Cécile, a woman revered for her knowledge of herbs and healing. She had suffered from a persistent cough, and Dr. Finch had taken her for treatment. She never came back. Dubois had simply announced her passing, attributing it to consumption. But Maman Cécile had been strong despite her age. Her disappearance had left a gaping hole in the community and a chilling question in Antoine's mind. Life on the plantation, despite these underlying currents of fear, followed a brutal, predictable rhythm. Days began before dawn with the ringing of the bell and ended long after sunset. The cotton fields stretched endlessly. their white bowls a deceptive symbol of purity against the backdrop of relentless labor. The air was always thick with the smell of earth, sweat, and the faint, sweet scent of sugarcane from a neighboring field. Antoine's days were a blur of physical exertion. He was a strong man, his muscles honed by years of work, but the constant strain took its toll. He worked alongside his fellow enslaved, their shared suffering forging a bond of silent understanding. There was Marie, his wife, who worked in the main house, her days filled with endless chores, her spirit resilient despite the indignities she faced. And their son, Etienne, a bright-eyed boy of 5, whose laughter was a rare, precious sound that Antoine clung to. Etienne was too young to understand the full weight of their existence, but Antoine saw the shadows already beginning to gather in his innocent eyes. The quarters, a collection of small, dilapidated cabins, offered little respite. They were crowded, hot, and often damp, but they were home. It was there in the evenings by the flickering light of a single candle that the true stories of Belle Rave were exchanged, whispered from mouth to ear, passed down through generations. Stories of cruelty, of injustice, and of the strange, unsettling presence of Dr. Finch. Antoine had always been a man of quiet observation. He watched, he listened, he remembered. He noticed the way Dr. Finch would sometimes walk through the fields, his gaze not on the cotton, but on the workers, a calculating glint in his eye. He noticed the way Dubois would sometimes visit Finch's clinic, their conversations low and secretive. He noticed the way Croft, usually so eager to inflict pain, seemed to avoid the clinic, a flicker of something akin to unease in his usually cold demeanor. The discovery of the unmarked graves had ripped open a wound that had festered beneath the surface of Belle Rave for years. It was not just a historical curiosity, it was a direct, tangible link to the whispered disappearances, to the strange experiments of Dr. Finch. The men who had dug those graves, Antoine among them, now carried a terrible burden. They had seen what was meant to remain hidden, and that knowledge was a dangerous thing on the Dubois plantation. As Antoine lay on his straw mat that night, the sounds of the quarters, a baby's cry, a low murmur of conversation, the rustle of leaves outside, seemed distant, muffled by the pounding of his own heart. He thought of the 21 silent witnesses in the earth, and the faces of those who had vanished. Maman Cécile, young Thomas, who had suffered from a persistent cough, and others whose names now floated like ghosts in his memory. He knew with a chilling certainty that the truth of Belle Rave was far darker than any whisper, any rumor. And he, Antoine Broussard, had just become an unwilling participant in its uncovering. The air in the quarters felt heavy, not just with the usual humidity, but with the weight of a secret that threatened to consume them all. The days following the discovery were shrouded in a palpable tension that hung over Belle Reve like the morning fog. The work in the fields continued, but the men who had unearthed the graves moved with a new, almost fearful circumspection. Their eyes constantly darted towards the newly cleared patch, now a raw, exposed wound in the earth, where the 21 crude coffins lay open to the elements. Monsieur Dubois, after his initial subdued reaction, had regained his composure, but his orders were clear and chillingly precise. The men were to continue the exhumation, but with extreme care. "I want to know what's in those boxes," he had stated, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "But I want no damage, no disturbance beyond what is necessary." The task was grim, a desecration forced upon them. Antoine, along with a few others, was assigned to the macabre duty. The sun beat down relentlessly, baking the exposed earth, and the faint, cloying odor from the graves grew stronger, more insistent. It was a smell that defied description, a mix of damp wood, decay, and something else, something metallic and sickly sweet that made Antoine's stomach churn. As they carefully pried open the decaying lids, the horrifying truth began to emerge, implicitly, through the fragments they uncovered. The contents were not skeletal remains laid out in peaceful repose. Instead, they found bundles wrapped in coarse, deteriorating cloth, stained dark with time and moisture. The cloth, once perhaps a simple shroud, now clung to what lay beneath, revealing only glimpses. Antoine, his hands trembling despite his efforts to control them, carefully lifted a corner of one such shroud. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. It was not a complete skeleton. Instead, there were bones, yes, but they were disarticulated, some unnaturally small, others strangely shaped. And amidst the bones he saw fragments of what looked like crude surgical instruments, rusted and corroded, but unmistakable in their purpose. A small curved blade, a length of wire, a piece of what might have been a clamp. He quickly dropped the cloth, his heart hammering against his ribs. He dared not speak, dared not even meet the eyes of the man working beside him, a quiet, older man named Honoré. But he knew Honoré had seen it too. The older man's face was ashen, his lips moving in a silent prayer. The implications were horrifying. These were not simple burials. These were not victims of a sudden illness. These were subjects. The bodies had been tampered with, dissected, experimented upon. The thought sent a wave of nausea through Antoine. He remembered the whispers about Dr. Finch, about his studies, about those who never returned from his clinic. The pieces of a terrible puzzle were beginning to fall into place, each one more grotesque than the last. Silas Croft, the overseer, stood watch over them, his presence a constant menacing shadow. He rarely spoke, but his eyes, cold and watchful, missed nothing. He carried his whip, not openly threatening, but its presence was a silent reminder of the consequences of disobedience, or worse, of speaking out. He seemed to understand the unspoken horror that was unfolding, and his grim silence was more terrifying than his usual bluster. One afternoon, as Antoine carefully brushed away earth from another coffin, he uncovered a small, intricately carved wooden bird, a cardinal tucked into the folds of a shroud. It was a child's toy, undoubtedly. A wave of profound sadness washed over him, quickly followed by a surge of cold fury. A child. They had done this to a child. He quickly recovered it, hoping Croft hadn't seen. The thought of Etienne, his own son, brought a fresh wave of terror. The evidence of medical procedures was undeniable, even to their untrained eyes. Some bundles contained what appeared to be organs, shriveled and unrecognizable, preserved in some dark, viscous fluid that had long since dried and stained the cloth. Others held bones that had been crudely reassembled or marked with strange incisions. It was a macabre tableau, a silent testament to unspeakable acts. Croft, sensing the growing unease and the unspoken questions among the workers, began to increase his threats, though subtly at first. "Remember what Monsieur Dubois said," he'd growl, his voice low and dangerous. "Not a word of this leaves this field. Not to your women, not to your children, not to the wind. Those who speak secrets find themselves in deeper holes than these." His gaze would sweep over them, lingering on Antoine, whose quiet intensity often drew Croft's suspicion. Antoine felt a constant knot of fear in his stomach. He knew the danger of what they were uncovering. He knew the danger of knowing, but he also knew he couldn't unsee what he had seen. The faces of the vanished, the whispers of Maman Cécile, the strange experiments of Dr. Finch. It all coalesced into a single, terrifying truth. The air itself seemed to thicken with the unspoken horror. The usual sounds of the plantation, the distant shouts, the creak of the cotton gin, the lowing of cattle, seemed muted, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The bayou, usually a source of life and mystery, now felt like a dark, watchful presence, its murky waters reflecting the secrets buried beneath the earth. At night, Antoine would lie awake, the images of the graves replaying in his mind. He would try to piece together the fragments, to understand the full scope of the horror. He thought of the sheer number of victims, the systematic nature of their burial. This wasn't a one-time event, it was a sustained, deliberate campaign of cruelty. And the fact that it had been hidden for so long, right beneath their feet, made the plantation feel like a living tomb. He looked at Marie sleeping beside him, her face peaceful in the dim light, and then at Etienne, curled up in his small corner. A fierce, protective instinct surged through him. He had to know. He had to understand. not just for himself, but for them, for all of them. The fear was immense, but the need for truth, for understanding, was growing stronger, a slow, burning ember in his soul. He knew that pursuing this truth could cost him everything, but the alternative, living in ignorance, allowing such horrors to remain buried, felt like a betrayal of the silent dead. The tension was not just in the air, it was in his very blood, a constant thrumming of dread and determination. The grim task of exhumation continued for days, each new coffin revealing more unsettling details. The sheer volume of evidence, though fragmented and decaying, painted a chilling picture. Antoine, driven by a desperate need to understand, began to pay closer attention to the comings and goings around Dr. Finch's isolated clinic. He noticed the doctor's infrequent visits to the main house, always at odd hours, and the way Dubois would sometimes send a young boy, a house servant, with a sealed note to the clinic. One sweltering afternoon, while working near the edge of the field, Antoine saw Dr. Finch leave his clinic, heading towards the main house. The doctor was carrying a leather satchel, his usual precise gait a little more hurried than usual. Antoine's heart pounded. This was his chance. He knew the risks, the severe punishment for being caught near the clinic, let alone inside it. But the image of the wooden cardinal, the child's toy, flashed in his mind, overriding his fear. He waited until Finch was out of sight, then moved swiftly, silently, through the tall grass and dense undergrowth that separated the field from the clinic. The small building, usually locked and shuttered, had a single window slightly ajar, likely left open for ventilation against the oppressive heat. Antoine approached cautiously, his senses heightened, every rustle of leaves, every distant bird call, a potential warning. He peered through the narrow opening. The room inside was dimly lit, filled with an array of strange equipment. Glass jars containing murky liquids, gleaming metal instruments laid out on a table, and shelves lined with thick, leather-bound books. The air was heavy with the scent of chemicals, antiseptic, and something else. Something faintly organic and disturbing. Antoine knew he couldn't enter through the window without making noise. He circled the building, his eyes scanning for another entry. He found a small, unlocked shed attached to the back, used for storing firewood and some gardening tools. It connected to the main clinic building by a narrow internal door. With a silent prayer, Antoine slipped inside. The shed was dark and stifling, smelling of damp earth and old wood. He fumbled for the internal door, his fingers brushing against rough planks. It creaked open with a groan that seemed deafening in the silence. He froze, listening, his heart hammering. No sound. He pushed the door further and stepped into the clinic. The main room was even more unsettling up close. The instruments on the table glinted menacingly. A large, stained wooden table dominated the center of the room, its surface scarred and dark. Antoine averted his gaze, his stomach churning. He had to find something, anything that would explain the graves. His eyes fell upon a small, locked cabinet against the far wall. It was too sturdy to force open. He scanned the room again, his gaze falling on a desk cluttered with papers and books. Among them, partially hidden beneath a stack of medical texts, was a small, leather-bound journal. It was old, its cover worn smooth with handling. Antoine snatched it, his fingers fumbling with the clasp. He knew he had limited time. He flipped it open, his eyes quickly scanning the elegant, precise handwriting. It was Dr. Finch's journal. The entries were dated, meticulously detailed, and written in a cold, clinical tone that sent a chill down Antoine's spine. He began to read, his breath catching in his throat with each horrifying revelation. The journal detailed studies and observations on various subjects, identified not by name but by numbers or vague descriptions. Subject 7, male, age approx. 30, persistent cough. Subject 12, female, age approx. 45, chronic fever. Subject 19, infant, severe malnutrition. The entries described procedures, dissections, and the effects of various treatments. Often crude, invasive surgeries performed without anesthesia, followed by detailed notes on the subject's responses and eventual demise. Antoine recognized some of the descriptions. Subject 7 could have been Thomas, the young man with the cough. Subject 12 sounded eerily like Maman Cécile, the infant, the wooden cardinal. A wave of profound horror washed over him. It was all there, laid bare in Finch's chillingly dispassionate prose. The experiments were real. The disappearances were not runaways or natural deaths. They were systematic murders disguised as medical research. He flipped further, his eyes scanning for any mention of Dubois. And there it was, in an entry dated several years prior. Discussed progress with Monsieur Dubois. He is pleased with the advances and the efficiency of the process. Funds secured for further acquisitions and expansion of research. Dubois. The plantation owner was not just complicit, he was an active participant funding and facilitating these atrocities. The acquisitions were people, enslaved men, women and children, delivered to Finch's clinic like specimens. The efficiency referred to the quick, silent disposal of the bodies, buried in unmarked graves, erased from existence. Antoine's hands trembled so violently he almost dropped the journal. He had to get out. He had to get this information out. But he couldn't take the journal. Its absence would be immediately noticed. He had to memorize what he could, the key details, the dates, the names he recognized. He forced himself to calm down, to focus, to imprint the horrifying facts into his memory. He saw mentions of correspondence with the New Orleans Medical Society and reports submitted to the Southern Medical Journal. Finch wasn't just a rogue madman. He was part of a larger, sanctioned network, his research potentially lauded by the medical establishment of the era. This wasn't just Belle Rave's secret. It was a secret woven into the very fabric of society. A sudden creak from outside jolted him. Finch was returning. Antoine slammed the journal shut, his heart leaping into his throat. He shoved it back under the stack of books, trying to make it look undisturbed. He darted back into the shed, pulling the door shut behind him, the wood groaning in protest. He heard Finch's footsteps approaching the clinic, the jingle of keys. Antoine pressed himself against the rough wooden wall of the shed, barely daring to breathe. He heard the clinic door open, then close. Footsteps moved inside. He waited, an eternity stretching in the stifling darkness. Finally he heard the faint click of a lock. Finch was inside, presumably unaware of the intrusion. Antoine waited a few more minutes, then cautiously, silently slipped out of the shed and melted back into the dense undergrowth. He moved with a speed and stealth he didn't know he possessed, his mind reeling with the enormity of what he had just discovered. He reached the quarters, his body shaking, his clothes soaked with sweat. He found Marie, her face etched with worry. "Antoine, where have you been? I was so afraid." He couldn't tell her everything, not yet. The danger was too great. But he looked at her, and then at Etienne, playing in the dirt, and a cold, hard resolve settled in his heart. He had the truth, a terrible, horrifying truth. And now he had to figure out what to do with it. The knowledge was a burning coal in his gut, a heavy burden, but also a weapon. He knew the names, the dates, the methods. He knew the complicity of Dubois and the potential involvement of a wider network. The truth, once buried, was now unearthed, and it demanded justice. But how could a man like him, an enslaved man on a Louisiana plantation, ever hope to achieve it? The question loomed vast and terrifying as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, ominous shadows over Belle Reve. The weight of the truth Antoine carried was a crushing burden, heavier than any bale of cotton. He had seen the evidence, read the chilling words in Dr. Finch's journal, and the full, horrifying scope of the conspiracy began to unfold in his mind. It wasn't just Dubois and Finch, it was a system, deeply entrenched, that allowed such atrocities to flourish. He tried to speak to Honoré, the older man who had worked beside him during the exhumation. Honoré, a man of quiet dignity and deep faith, had seen enough to understand the implications. Antoine, in hushed tones, recounted what he had read in the journal. The names, the procedures, Dubois' complicity. Honoré listened, his face growing grimmer with each word, his eyes filled with a profound sorrow and fear. "Mon Dieu, Antoine," Honoré whispered, his voice trembling. "This is a wickedness beyond imagining. But what can we do? Who would listen to us? We are nothing." Honoré's words echoed Antoine's own fears. They were enslaved. Their testimony was worthless in the eyes of the law. The local authorities, the sheriff, the magistrates, they were all part of the same social fabric, often plantation owners themselves, or beholden to them. Antoine knew that if he were to approach them, he would be dismissed, perhaps even punished for daring to accuse a white man, let alone a man of Dubois' standing and influence. He remembered a story from years ago, of a neighboring plantation where an enslaved man had tried to report a brutal beating. The man had been accused of lying, whipped for insubordination, and then sold downriver, never to be seen again. The system was designed to protect itself, to silence any voice that dared to challenge its authority. Antoine also recalled Finch's journal mentioning correspondence with the New Orleans Medical Society and reports submitted to the Southern Medical Journal. This wasn't just a local horror, it was sanctioned, perhaps even encouraged, by the very institutions meant to uphold ethics and knowledge. The thought was sickening. It meant that the science of the era, in some dark corners, was built upon the suffering of people like him. He began to observe the interactions between Dubois and other prominent figures in the parish. He noticed the frequent visits of Monsieur Beaumont, owner of a vast sugar plantation upstream, and Monsieur Delacroix, a wealthy merchant from New Orleans who often supplied goods to Belle Rêve. Their conversations with Dubois were always private, held in the study or on the veranda, away from prying ears. Antoine couldn't hear their words, but he saw the knowing glances, the subtle nods, the air of shared understanding that passed between them. Were they involved? Were other plantations also harboring such horrors, or simply turning a blind eye to Dubois' research? The web of corruption seemed to stretch far beyond Belle Rêve. Antoine's attempts to find an ally, a sympathetic ear, were met with fear and resignation. He spoke in veiled terms to a few trusted elders in the quarters, hinting at the nature of the graves. Their responses were always the same: a shake of the head, a sigh, a warning to be careful. "Some secrets are best left buried, Antoine," old man Pierre had advised, his eyes filled with a weary wisdom. "The ground holds its own counsel, and sometimes it is safer to let it keep it." But Antoine couldn't. The faces of the victims, the image of the wooden cardinal, haunted his waking hours and invaded his dreams. He saw the fear in Marie's eyes, the innocent joy in Etienne's, and he knew he couldn't stand by. He had to try. He considered running away, taking Marie and Etienne, and seeking help in the north. But the risks were immense. The vast, unforgiving swamps of Louisiana, the slave patrols, the bounty hunters. The chances of success were slim, and the consequences of failure unimaginable. And even if they made it, who would believe his story? A runaway slave accusing a prominent plantation owner and a respected doctor of murder and experimentation? It was a fantasy. The economic and social systems of the South were designed to protect men like Dubois. Their wealth, their status, their very way of life depended on the subjugation of people like Antoine. To challenge them was to challenge the entire edifice of their society. The horror of the unmarked graves was not an anomaly. It was a symptom of a deeper, more pervasive sickness. Antoine felt a growing sense of isolation. He was surrounded by people, yet utterly alone in his knowledge and his desperate need for justice. The conspiracy of silence was not just a deliberate act by the powerful. It was also a forced complicity, a survival mechanism for those who had no voice, no power. He began to notice subtle changes in the plantation's atmosphere. Croft, usually quick to anger, seemed more watchful, his eyes constantly scanning the workers as if searching for any sign of dissent or knowledge. Dubois himself made more frequent, unannounced visits to the fields, his gaze lingering on Antoine and the other men who had worked on the graves. The unspoken threat was clear. They were being watched. One evening, a young man named Lucien, who had also helped with the exhumation, was found badly beaten near the edge of the quarters. Croft claimed Lucien had tried to steal food, but everyone knew it was a lie. Lucien had been a quiet, compliant worker. His injuries were severe, a clear message to anyone who might consider speaking out. Lucien, terrified, refused to say anything, his eyes wide with fear. Antoine understood. The conspiracy of silence was not just about ignoring the truth. It was about actively suppressing it, violently if necessary. The horror of the graves was not just in what they contained, but in the lengths to which the powerful would go to keep their secrets buried. He felt the walls closing in, the net tightening. He had uncovered the truth, but now the truth was a dangerous predator, and he, Antoine, was its prey. The bayou, usually a source of comfort, now seemed to whisper warnings, its dark waters reflecting the impenetrable depths of human cruelty and complicity. The beating of Lucien sent a chilling message through the quarters, a stark reminder of the consequences of knowing too much. Fear, already a constant companion, now settled deeper, heavier in Antoine's heart. He knew he was being watched, his every move scrutinized by Croft, and perhaps even by Dubois himself. The air around him felt charged with unspoken threats, a constant hum of danger. Antoine tried to be more cautious, to blend in, to appear as just another laborer. But the knowledge he carried was a burning ember, impossible to extinguish. He saw the faces of the victims in his dreams, heard the silent accusations from the unmarked graves. He couldn't simply forget, couldn't simply go back to the way things were. The direct threats began subtly. One morning, Antoine found his shovel handle deliberately weakened, almost snapping in his hands during work. Another time, a venomous snake, usually shy of human presence, was found coiled near his sleeping mat, a clear warning left by someone. He knew these were not accidents. These were deliberate acts, designed to intimidate, to remind him of his vulnerability. He noticed Dr. Finch's continued presence on the plantation, seemingly undisturbed by the discovery of the graves. The clinic remained active, its shutters closed, its secrets guarded. Antoine sometimes saw figures being led to the clinic, usually at night, their faces obscured by darkness, their steps hesitant. The horror was ongoing, the experiments continuing even as their victims lay unearthed in the field. The sheer audacity, the callous disregard for human life, filled Antoine with a cold rage. The psychological toll on Antoine was immense. He slept little, haunted by nightmares. During the day he was constantly on edge, his senses hyper-alert, searching for danger in every shadow, every rustle of leaves. He saw the fear reflected in the eyes of Marie, who, though he had not told her the full extent of his discovery, sensed his growing torment. She would hold his hand in the darkness, her touch a fragile comfort against the encroaching dread. He also noticed the subtle changes in the behavior of other enslaved people. Some avoided him, their eyes darting away when he approached, fearing that his dangerous knowledge might infect them. Others, however, looked at him with a silent plea, a desperate hope that he might somehow find a way to expose the truth. He felt the weight of their unspoken expectations, adding to his already heavy burden. One evening, as Antoine was returning from the fields, Croft intercepted him. The overseer's face was grim, his eyes narrowed. "You've been asking too many questions, Broussard," Croft said, his voice a low growl. "Poking your nose where it doesn't belong. Monsieur Dubois doesn't like that. He doesn't like curious minds." Antoine's heart hammered, but he forced himself to remain calm. "I ask no questions, Master Croft," he replied, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "I only work the fields as I'm told." Croft stepped closer, his breath smelling of stale tobacco and cheap whiskey. "Don't play the fool with me. I've seen the way you look at those graves, the way you look at the clinic. You think you know something, don't you?" He leaned in, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Let me tell you something, Broussard. Some things are best left buried, and those who dig too deep, sometimes they find themselves buried right alongside them, and no one will ever know they were there." The threat was clear, unmistakable. Croft's words were not just his own, they were Dubois'. Antoine felt a cold sweat break out on his brow. He was no longer just a witness, he was a target. The next day, A small fire broke out in the quarters, dangerously close to Antoine's cabin. It was quickly extinguished, but the message was clear. His life and the lives of his family were in direct peril. He looked at Etienne, playing innocently in the dirt, and a fierce, desperate resolve hardened within him. He couldn't let them win. He couldn't let this horror continue. He knew he couldn't fight Dubois and Finch directly. He was an enslaved man, powerless in their world. But he had knowledge, and knowledge, even in chains, could be a dangerous thing. He began to think, to plan, to search for a way, however small, to expose the truth. He remembered Finch's journal, the mentions of the New Orleans Medical Society, the Southern Medical Journal. Perhaps there was a way to send a message, a whisper that could grow into a shout beyond the confines of Belle Rêve. The bayou, with its dense foliage and winding waterways, offered a slim hope. He had heard stories of messages carried by sympathetic boatmen, of whispers reaching ears far away. It was a desperate gamble, but what other choice did he have? To remain silent was to condemn himself, his family, and countless others to the same fate as those in the unmarked graves. The danger was escalating, the threats growing more explicit, more violent. Antoine felt like a trapped animal, but a spark of defiance, fueled by the memory of the victims and the love for his family, ignited within him. He would not be silenced. He would not let their deaths be in vain. The oppressive Louisiana air, thick with humidity and the scent of decay, now also carried the faint, defiant scent of a man pushed to his breaking point, ready to fight for a truth that refused to stay buried. The escalating threats had pushed Antoine to the brink, but they had also sharpened his resolve. He knew he couldn't simply wait for the inevitable. He had to act. His mind, usually focused on the day's labor, now worked with a feverish intensity, piecing together fragments of information, searching for a weakness in the impenetrable wall of silence surrounding Belle Rêve. He remembered the specific details from Dr. Finch's journal, the names of the medical societies, the dates of correspondence, the chillingly precise descriptions of the studies. He knew that if he could somehow get this information to the outside world, to someone who might listen, it could be their only hope. His opportunity came during a particularly busy week when Dubois was away on business in New Orleans and Croft was preoccupied with a damaged cotton gin. Dr. Finch, however, remained on the plantation, his clinic still a place of dark activity. Antoine, feigning a sudden illness, managed to get himself assigned to lighter duties near the main house, giving him a chance to observe. He noticed a young house servant, a boy named Louis, who occasionally ran errands for Dr. Finch, carrying sealed envelopes to the post office in the nearest town, Bayou Teche. Louis was a quiet, timid boy, but Antoine had seen a flicker of fear in his eyes when he spoke of the clinic. Antoine approached Louis cautiously, offering him a small piece of dried meat he had saved. "Louis," he began, his voice low and gentle. "You carry letters for the doctor, yes?" Louis nodded, his eyes wide. "Yes, Antoine. To the post office. Do you ever wonder what is in those letters?" Antoine asked, his gaze steady. Louis hesitated, then whispered, "Sometimes they are always sealed, but the doctor, he is a strange man." Antoine leaned closer. "Louis, I need your help. It is a dangerous thing I ask, but it is for the good of us all, for the good of those who have disappeared." He saw the boy's eyes widen further, a dawning comprehension. "I need you to carry a different message, a message that must reach the right hands." He explained in veiled terms the horror of the graves, the experiments, the names he had seen in the journal. He didn't show the boy the journal, but he recounted enough details to make the truth undeniable. Louis listened, his face growing paler and paler, his small body trembling. But Monsieur Dubois, Master Croft," Louis stammered, fear warring with a nascent sense of outrage. "They will never know it was you," Antoine promised. "I will write the message. You will simply deliver it as you deliver the doctor's letters, but this one you will give to a specific person, a man named Monsieur Thibodeau, the editor of the Gazette de la Louisiane in New Orleans. He is a man who writes about justice, Antoine had heard whispers of Thibodeau, a rare voice of dissent in the local papers. The risk was immense for Louis, but the boy, perhaps swayed by Antoine's quiet conviction and the sheer horror of the story, finally nodded, his jaw set. "I will do it, Antoine. For Maman Cécile. For the others." That night, by the flickering light of a stolen candle, Antoine painstakingly wrote his message on a scrap of paper he had found. He wrote of the unmarked graves, the 21 bodies, the evidence of medical experimentation, the names of the victims he remembered from Finch's journal, the complicity of Dubois, and the ongoing nature of the atrocities. He wrote with a desperate urgency, knowing that this was his one chance. He sealed the note with a drop of wax, making it look like any other official correspondence. The next morning, with a pounding heart, Antoine handed the sealed note to Louis, instructing him precisely on how to deliver it. Louis, his face pale but determined, tucked the note deep into his pocket and set off for Bayou Teche. Days passed, each one an eternity of agonizing suspense. Antoine worked, watched, and waited, every shadow a potential threat, every sound a possible sign of discovery. He saw Dr. Finch continue his work, oblivious, or perhaps simply uncaring, that his secrets might be exposed. He saw Dubois return, his usual stern demeanor intact, seemingly unaware of the silent rebellion brewing beneath his very nose. Then one morning, a carriage arrived at Belle Rêve, not the usual visitors, but a group of stern-faced men in dark suits. Among them, Antoine recognized the figure of Monsieur Thibodeau, his face grim, his eyes sharp and observant. With him were two other men, one carrying a large ledger, the other a camera, a strange box-like contraption. A cold dread mixed with a surge of desperate hope washed over Antoine. His message had reached its destination. The men confronted Dubois, their voices low but firm. Antoine, working nearby, strained to hear. He caught fragments: unmarked graves, allegations of medical malpractice, human experimentation, official inquiry. Dubois' face, usually so composed, was a mask of disbelief and then cold fury. He denied everything, of course, dismissing the claims as outrageous lies from disgruntled Negroes. He tried to intimidate them, to use his influence, but these men were different. They were not local authorities. They were from New Orleans, representing a nascent public interest in justice, spurred by Thibodeau's relentless pursuit of truth. The men insisted on inspecting the clinic and the graves. Dubois, cornered, had no choice but to comply. They went to the field where the 21 graves lay exposed, a silent, damning testament. They opened the crude coffins, and the men from New Orleans, their faces growing pale, saw the horrifying evidence for themselves. The disarticulated bones, the crude instruments, the stained shrouds. The camera flashed, capturing the grim reality. Then they went to Dr. Finch's clinic. Finch, initially defiant, quickly crumbled under the weight of the evidence and the stern questioning. The ledger-carrying man, a representative from the New Orleans Medical Society, found Finch's journal, the very one Antoine had read. The entries, once chillingly clinical, now read like a confession of unspeakable crimes. The full scope of the horror was laid bare. The systematic nature of the experimentation, the sheer number of victims, the callous disregard for their lives, all under the guise of scientific advancement. The final revelation was not a single moment, but a cascade of horrifying truths. The men from New Orleans discovered that Finch had indeed been submitting reports, albeit heavily sanitized ones, to various medical journals, and had even received some minor accolades for his innovative research. The medical establishment, in its pursuit of knowledge, had, at best, turned a blind eye, and at worst, tacitly encouraged these atrocities. The victims were not just those buried in the field. They were also the countless others whose suffering had been dismissed, whose humanity had been denied, all in the name of a twisted science. Antoine watched from a distance, a silent witness to the unfolding drama. He saw Dubois' face, contorted in a mixture of rage and fear, as his carefully constructed world began to crumble. He saw Dr. Finch, his precise demeanor shattered, his eyes wide with a desperate, cornered animal's terror. The truth, once buried, had finally erupted, a geyser of unspeakable horror. But even as he felt a flicker of triumph, a cold dread settled in. He knew that even with the truth exposed, justice, true justice, might still be a distant, elusive dream in a world built on such profound inequality. The battle was far from over. The arrival of the men from New Orleans, spurred by Antoine's desperate message, had indeed ripped open the carefully constructed facade of Belle Rêve. The immediate aftermath was a whirlwind of activity, a brief, chaotic disruption to the plantation's grim routine. Dr. Finch was arrested, his clinic sealed, his journals and instruments confiscated as evidence. Monsieur Dubois, though not immediately arrested, was subjected to intense questioning, his reputation irrevocably tarnished. The Gazette de la Louisiane published a scathing exposé, detailing the horrors of the unmarked graves and Dr. Finch's medical experiments, sending shockwaves through the polite society of New Orleans. For a fleeting moment, Antoine felt a surge of hope. Perhaps finally justice would be served. Perhaps the silent dead would find peace, and the living would be spared further suffering. But the wheels of justice, especially in 1850 Louisiana, turned slowly and often not at all for those without power. The initial outrage eventually faded, replaced by a quiet, insidious campaign of damage control. Dubois, a man of immense wealth and influence, began to exert his power. The local authorities, initially hesitant, soon fell back into line. The narrative began to shift. Dr. Finch, it was argued, was a rogue, a madman, acting alone, his research an aberration, not representative of the esteemed medical community. Dubois, it was claimed, was merely an unwitting patron, deceived by Finch's scientific pretensions. The graves, the 21 silent witnesses, were quietly covered up. Not reinterred with dignity, but simply reburied, the earth smoothed over, erasing the evidence once more. Official records were falsified or simply lost. The names of the victims, briefly brought to light in Finch's journal, were once again swallowed by the silence. The wooden cardinal, the child's toy, was reburied with the rest, its small, defiant presence once again hidden from the world. Dr. Finch, after a brief, hushed trial, was found guilty, not of murder, but of unethical medical practices and disturbing the peace. His sentence was surprisingly lenient. A few years in a state asylum, a convenient way to silence him and discredit his testimony, painting him as insane rather than a calculating perpetrator. Within a few years, whispers would circulate that he had escaped or been released, disappearing into the vast, anonymous landscape of the American West, perhaps to continue his dark work elsewhere under a new name. Monsieur Dubois faced no legal consequences. His wealth and connections proved too strong. The scandal, though damaging, was eventually swept under the rug. He paid a hefty sum in reparations to the New Orleans Medical Society for the embarrassment Finch had caused, and quietly resumed his life. His power diminished, but not broken. The whispers about Belle Rêve continued, but they were once again relegated to the shadows, dismissed as mere gossip. Antoine's fate was more complex. His role in exposing the truth was never officially acknowledged. Louis, the young house servant, was quietly sold to a distant plantation, a silent warning to anyone else who might consider speaking out. Antoine himself was not punished directly, but his life on Belle Rêve became a living hell. Croft's threats became a constant reality, his cruelty more refined, more insidious. Antoine was assigned the hardest, most dangerous tasks. His rations subtly reduced, his family constantly under threat. He was never beaten openly, but the psychological torment was relentless, a slow, grinding punishment designed to break his spirit. He survived, but he was never the same. The trauma of what he had witnessed, what he had uncovered, and the profound injustice of the aftermath left an indelible mark. He carried the ghosts of the unmarked graves within him, their silent cries echoing in his soul. He looked at Marie, her face etched with worry, and at Etienne, growing taller, his eyes still holding a flicker of innocence that Antoine desperately tried to protect. He taught Etienne to be cautious, to observe, to remember, but also to never truly trust the world around him. The unmarked graves of Belle-Rave were forgotten by the world, but not by Antoine. He knew where they lay, beneath the newly cultivated field, a silent testament to a horror that society had chosen to ignore. He knew that the true monsters were not supernatural specters, but men, and the systems they built to protect their power and privilege. As the years passed, the cotton fields of Belle-Rave continued to yield their bounty. The grand manor house stood proud, and the bayou continued its slow, indifferent flow. But for Antoine, and for the few who remembered, the land itself held a different story. A story of 21 souls, buried without names, without dignity, their lives stolen, their deaths erased. A story that whispered in the rustle of the cane, in the mournful cry of the heron, in the oppressive heat of the Louisiana sun. A story that served as a chilling reminder that some horrors, once unearthed, can never truly be reburied, not in the hearts of those who bore witness. And the most disturbing truth of all was that, in a world built on such foundations, the unmarked graves of Belle-Rave were likely not the only ones. They were merely the ones that, for a brief, terrifying moment, had dared to speak.